Hi, I'm Mark, and today we have to talk about Brexit again. But what was the problem with the Northern Ireland Protocol again? The protocol was part of the Brexit agreement between the EU and Great Britain, and it was intended to avoid a hard border with good checks between Northern Ireland and the rest of the Emerald Isle. Otherwise, it was feared violent conflict in Northern Ireland could flare up again. The protocol stipulated that Northern Ireland effectively remained part of the EU internal market, and companies that deliver plant and animal products from England, Wales, or Scotland to Northern Ireland therefore had to fill out numerous forms in order to comply with EU health regulations. And for some, it was just too difficult. They no longer delivered to Northern Ireland, where many supermarket shelves remained empty of those goods. Today's British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak described the protocol as a miracle cure for Brexit during the 2019 election campaign. Then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who signed it in October 2019, made him Chancellor of the Exchequer out of gratitude. On Monday, Sunak publicly changed his mind. Together with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, he announced that the protocol would be replaced by a new agreement, the Windsor Framework, which is not completely correct, by the way. But what has now been agreed? The EU's most important concession is with the help of London, the Northern Ireland Regional Parliament can veto future EU food directives, provided they affect Northern Ireland and 30 MPs from at least two parties want it. Apparently, von der Leyen was so happy that she no longer had to negotiate with Sunak's chaotic predecessor Boris Johnson that she buckled, as some believed. But the EU Commission later restricted that it was an emergency mechanism that could only be used in a very exceptional circumstances as a last resort. I come to that later again. And in addition, the EU could respond with countermeasures in this case. The UK government is also allowed to set VAT for Northern Ireland, but also with restrictions. Only immovable objects such as wind turbines, solar systems and heat pumps may be subject to reduced tax rates. And when goods are transported from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, there will in future be a red and a green lane. I mentioned that several times. The new Northern Ireland implementation regime goes further than some hard Brexiteers wanted. Nevertheless, political progress or protest is not to be expected. London and Brussels have once again agreed on this settlement, and nearly 7 years after Brexit, the latest deal goes further than any previous deal into the wishes of the hardliners in the European Research Group, the ERG, the Eurosceptic Tories, and Northern Ireland's Unionist Democratic Party, the DUP. For large parts of the DUP, it is still not enough though, because they do not want a solution at all. After Brexit, the special regulation for the Northern Irish region became necessary as it connects the EU member Ireland with the only land border of the EU with Great Britain. And London and Brussels agreed on the Northern Ireland Protocol. The region left the EU, but since it remained in the European single market, good checks in the Irish Sea became necessary. The Unionists of Northern Ireland, on the other hand, were up in arms and organized violent riots, such as in April 21. They saw the integrity of the region in the United Kingdom threatened. The Union would be in danger because the agreement will bring about Ireland's economic reunification. In February 22, the DUP left the regional government in Belfast in protest at the regulation. Even the elections in May did not bring about a rethink. On the contrary, positions continued to tighten. The DUP demanded the complete abolition of the Northern Ireland Protocol as a precondition for new negotiations. The Northern Ireland Protocol was not abandoned last Monday. The changes are a bit sweeping, surprising even some of the hardest Brexiteers in the Conservative ranks. However, if individual Tories around Boris Johnson rebel against Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, they will not be able to stop it. Keir Starmer and his Labour Party support the agreement and will bring Sunak the votes he needs in the House of Commons if necessary. Still, the new agreement is unlikely to resolve the political deadlock in Northern Ireland, although on the face of, if the DUP has achieved what it wanted, the Windsor Framework programme will replace parts of the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And in concrete terms, this will mean that goods checks within the Irish Sea will largely be eliminated, and the administrative burden for trade between the Irish island and Great Britain will be simplified. But EU chief negotiator Maroš Šefčovič said that the Stormont break used to allay concerns among unionists and Brexiteers is very limited and subject to very strict conditions. Finally, we hear that from the EU and not the British. Mr. Sunak used this mechanism to persuade DUP members that this new deal would allow Northern Ireland politicians to ban new EU rules affecting the province. However, Mr. Šefčovič told MEPs this week that Brussels has the power to respond to any decision with trade sanctions, such as tariffs, for example, on British exports. The DUP has been boycotting government work in Northern Irish Regional Parliament in Stormont for a year, allegedly because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. The DUP does not want to be pushed before it announces its position on the new Windsor Framework. They said, "We will take our time," and party leader Jeffrey Donaldson stressed on Tuesday when Sunak was in Belfast to convince the unionists of his new deal with the EU. Although it's not a new deal, it's making things a bit more precise. Because the ECJ remains responsible for disputes over Northern Ireland, one of the main conditions of the EU. This bumps up ERG and DUP, and Sunak tries to accommodate them with a Stormont veto. Stormont is supposed to be able to prevent future changes to the Windsor Agreement with a veto, and in return, Sunak gave up Johnson-era legislation allowing London to unilaterally override Brexit rules against international law. But in the next few weeks, the DUP will consult its partners, according to party circles. One of those partners already gave its position on Thursday. The unionist think tank Centre for the Union, I talked about this in another video, whose members include DUP MP Ian Paisley Jr. and Loyalist blogger Jamie Bryson, recommended after legal review not to approve the deal. Bryson has been a speaker at Loyalist protests for years and is said to have close ties to the paramilitary Ulster Volunteer Force. Another partner that the DUP will consult is the Loyalist Community Council, which represents Loyalist paramilitaries. They want to prevent the DUP from agreeing to the agreement and returning to Stormont. Loyalist organizations, which the EU classifies as terrorist, will have a major say in whether the Brussels-London agreement can be implemented in the coming weeks. They might not stop it, but it will have consequences for Stormont. The DUP does not want to incur the wrath of these loyalist organizations because the loyalist terrorist organizations have considerable influence in working-class unionist districts. According to a BBC study, they have 12,000 members. And on May 18th, there are local elections in Northern Ireland. That's when the DUP needs the loyalist votes. Before that, an announcement of their decision on the Brexit question is not to be expected. Whether the DUP will then agree to the Windsor Framework is just as unlikely. What the DUP actually wants is to keep the Republican Party Sinn Féin out of power, because if the DUP agreed to the new agreement, they would also have to return to Stormont. A resumption of work would mean that Michelle O'Neill would be the first nationalist head of government in Northern Ireland, because in the elections last May, Sinn Féin became the strongest party for the first time. And according to the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement, which was supposed to end the bloody Northern Ireland conflict in 1998, she's now entitled to the office of head of government. Free coalition elections are not possible in Northern Ireland. The political system of the Northern Irish it's a consociational democracy, and it requires that the strongest party of the second grouping with the strongest party provides the government. In order to elect the head of government, you need a parliamentary speaker. And the DUP is boycotting this process by not nominating its own candidate as required by the Good Friday Agreement. Because if the DUP allowed Michelle O'Neill to have a nationalist head of government, the DUP would lose enormous support among their unionist and the loyalist paramilitaries, would call for violent protests. Even if some media suggest that the DUP will return to Stormont with the agreement, they may not have to. For the unionists, direct control by London is an acceptable option in the long term. If Sunak holds out after losing local elections on May 4th, the Windsor Framework is likely to pass Parliament. Will not end the political stalemate in Northern Ireland, though. 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement, the DUP is using the terms of the peace agreement to make Northern Ireland ungovernable. They will continue these tactics as long as they can use them to keep Sinn Féin out of power. And that, and not a softer Brexit, is what unionists want first and foremost. And that's what I said in a lot of videos here. The whole Northern Ireland Protocol thing is just a smokescreen by the DUP. That is not their real target. They don't want to be second in Northern Ireland, and that's all. And that's why I think the theory that they might drag on the whole thing until the local elections is a very possible thing. The only other thing is everybody else in Great Britain is talking about having a vote on the Windsor Framework in the next few weeks, or the next 2 weeks even, or this week or next week. Just counting. Yeah, it would be next week from what we heard in the first place. But in this case, the DUP would just play the offended one, and Sunak said he will give them the time they need to think about the Windsor Framework. If he sticks to his word there, they really can drag it on until after the local elections. So it's another round of gambling. And so then it will be possible that we will not see a vote in the House of Commons before the end of May or the beginning of June even. Don't know when they go to break again. But it's really quite complicated still. And that the paramilitary groups will put pressure on the DUP in this case is not a secret. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.